So picture this. It is 416 BC.
Right.
And this ancient, just sprawling empire sails a massive armada right up to a tiny island in the Aegean Sea.
The island of Melos.
Yeah, Melos, which, by the way, was strategically totally insignificant. I mean, they were neutral.
Right. They hadn't provoked a war or anything.
Exactly. They just wanted to be left alone, to farm and trade. But this empire, they offer them this chilling, basically binary choice.
Submit or die.
Submit and become our slaves or be utterly annihilated. And when the leaders of this little island pleaded for justice, like appealing to fairness and the gods,
The empire's ambassadors didn't even flinch.
no, they didn't even pretend to care about morality. They essentially just said, well, justice is a fairy tale we tell children. In the real world, the strong do whatever they want and the weak suffer whatever they must.
It is brutal.
It's so brutal. And that empire was Athens. And their unvarnished logic, which, by the way, ultimately led to the massacre of every adult man on that island and the enslavement of all the women and children, was meticulously recorded by a guy named Thucydides.
Yeah, and the sheer unapologetic darkness of that moment is just staggering. I mean, Thucydides, who was actually an Athenian general himself, he didn't record that conversation to celebrate it.
Right.
He recorded it more like a clinician documenting the terminal stages of a fatal disease. He was watching his own civilization, which was supposedly the pinnacle of human culture, just tear itself to pieces during the Peloponnesian War.
And that really is the foundation of our deep dive today. We're looking at this incredible set of sources centered around a document called Moral Lessons from Thucydides, which examines his account of this catastrophic war from 431 to 404 BC.
It's a fascinating text.
It is. But I want to be super clear right up front about the mission of our time together today, because we aren't just doing a dry academic recap of ancient troop movement.
No, nobody wants that.
Right, exactly. The objective here is to explore how this deeply secular 5th century BC text can actually inspire you, the listener, to love Christ more deeply and to equip you to live for him more fully in your everyday life.
Which, presents a pretty profound paradox right away.
How so?
Well, Thucydides lived 400 years before the incarnation of Christ. He had absolutely no knowledge of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Oh, right. He's totally pagan.
Completely. His worldview was entirely shaped by the brutal realities of Greek power politics. So, he doesn't offer a theology of redemption at all.
But I think that's exactly why his work is so valuable for the Christian. I mean, reading pagan historians is kind of like reverse engineering a highly destructive computer virus.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right, because you don't study the virus because you want to infect your own hard drive.
Yeah.
You study it to understand the fundamental vulnerabilities in the system's architecture. So Thucydides acts as this, brilliant diagnostic tool for fallen humanity. He maps out the exact contours of the human heart's capacity for self-deception, paving the way for the gospel by showing us the terrifying reality of a world without it.
Yeah, and that diagnostic precision is really what makes it a masterpiece. Because when you read Thucydides, you immediately notice the absence of moralizing.
He doesn't preach.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He never pauses the narrative to deliver a sermon. He doesn't spoon-feed you with explicit condemnations of Athenian hubris.
So how does he make his point, then?
Well, he constructs the narrative to do the heavy lifting for him. He relies on this agonizingly careful structure, placing events side by side in ironic juxtaposition.
Ah.
Yeah, he utilizes the mechanics of tragic storytelling to demonstrate the inevitable, devastating consequences of human pride.
So he essentially builds a mirror.
That's a great way to put it.
And the reflection in that mirror is entirely devoid of the restraining grace of God. It provides this perfect, contrasting backdrop to the biblical narrative of creation, fall, and redemption.
Right, because by zooming in on the mechanics of the fall, like how societies actually collapse under the weight of their own sin, the redemption we find in Scripture becomes an urgent necessity.
It's not just a comforting idea anymore.
No, it's a rescue operation.
Yeah.
But to fully grasp the weight of that mirror, we really need to understand the geopolitical powder keg that Thucydides was observing.
Let's set the stage then.
Yeah, so the Hellenic world was completely polarized by two superpowers. On one side, you have Athens.
The naval empire.
Exactly. A maritime empire, vastly wealthy, deeply democratic, and culturally vibrant. They ruled over this massive alliance known as the Delian League.
So their power is very fluid, fast, aggressive.
Yes. And on the other side, you have Sparta. Sparta is the quintessential land power.
Very different vibe.
Totally different.
Yeah.
They are an oligarchic, deeply conservative military state leading the Peloponnesian League. And they are absolutely terrified of Athenian expansion.
So it's basically a structural inevitability that these two are going to violently collide.
It was just a matter of time. And Thucydides is caught right in the middle of it.
Because he was Athenian.
Right. Born around 460 BC into a wealthy aristocratic family.
Yeah.
He was a product of the Athenian Golden Age. So when the war broke out, he wasn't just observing from a distance.
He was a general.
Yes, a strategos. He commanded a squadron of ships.
But, and this is crucial, his military career ends in absolute disaster.
It really does.
The sources highlight this pivotal moment at a northern city called Amphipolis, which was a really big deal for Athens because it provided the timber they needed to build their ships.
Timber was everything for a naval empire.
Right. So Thucydides is tasked with defending it from this brilliant Spartan commander named Brasidas. But he gets there just a fraction too late. The city falls.
Which you just couldn't do in Athens.
No, the Athenian democracy was notoriously unforgiving of failure. So they strip him of his command and exile him for 20 years.
And that exile, ironically, is the catalyst for the history we're reading today.
Because if he had stayed a successful general, what happens?
Well, his history would likely have been completely tainted by patriotic bias. He would have been too embedded in the Athenian echo chamber to see the structural rot.
But exile forces him into the margins.
Exactly. He becomes a stateless person, traversing a war-torn world. He can walk into Spartan camps.
Wow, yeah.
He can interview the Peloponnesian allies. He can speak to the very people whose homes Athens destroyed.
So it's precisely the kind of access that breeds objectivity?
Right. He gathered eyewitness accounts from every conceivable angle, cross-examining them rigorously. He viewed the conflict not as a partisan defending his homeland, but as a pathologist examining a corpse.
He wants to know what killed the patient.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, though, because I struggle with this framing just a little. I mean, if a man is exiled by his own people, disgraced and banished for 2 decades, doesn't that inherently breed bitterness?
It's a fair question.
Like, how do we know his quote-unquote objective pathology isn't just a cynical, resentful takedown of the democracy that rejected him? Is his tragic framing of history a product of genuine realism, or is he just a pessimist projecting his own failure onto the universe?
So that is actually a highly debated question among classicists, but the internal evidence of the text points toward a profound, terrifying realism.
How so?
Well, because he actually praises Athenian ingenuity. He frequently acknowledges the brilliance of their early leadership. He doesn't write a cartoonish villain origin story for his own city.
So he's not just grinding an axe.
No. Instead, he structures his history using the recognized mechanics of classical Greek tragedy to demonstrate a universal human pattern.
And that tragic structure is fascinating because it's not just a timeline of this happened, then that happened.
No, it follows a distinct arc. In a Greek tragedy, the protagonist, which in this narrative is the Athenian Empire itself, begins with immense greatness. But that greatness is coupled with a fatal flaw. A hamartia. The early books of Thucydides established this greatness. We see the astonishing growth of Athenian naval power, the wealth pouring into the city, the cultural zenith.
But we also see the seeds of the flaw.
Yes, a restless, insatiable ambition that sparks deep paranoia in Sparta.
And then the narrative pacing just shifts. We move through the early, inconclusive campaigns. We witness the horrifying outbreak of the plague in Athens, which fundamentally shakes their moral foundation.
Yeah, that plague was devastating.
And the tension continuously ratchets up towards self-inflicted disaster.
He employs the concept of peripeteia, which is the sudden reversal of fortune brought on by the protagonist's own hubris. Thucydides isn't imposing a fictional tragedy onto real events. He's utilizing the tragic framework because he perceives that human nature, left to its own devices, inevitably follows a tragic trajectory.
And man, this maps so cleanly onto biblical anthropology.
I've heard.
When we talk about the old man in Christian theology, this is the historical outworking of it. I mean, in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul writes about putting off the old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires.
Yes.
Thucydides is giving us a high-definition societal-level analysis of those deceitful desires. He demonstrates the mechanics of humanity trapped in a closed loop of ambition, violence, and collapse, entirely devoid of redemptive grace.
And understanding the architecture of that closed loop is vital for the believer. Because if you only have a superficial grasp of the disease, your appreciation for the cure will be equally superficial.
Wow. Yeah, that's so true.
When you see the tragic reality of human nature operating autonomously, the gospel ceases to be a mere ethical upgrade to an already decent life. It reveals itself as an emergency rescue operation.
Which brings us back to the specific mechanism of that collapse, because it wasn't just, poor logistics or bad weather that doomed Athens.
Yeah, not at all.
The grand tragedy was driven by a deeply ingrained psychological posture. The disease has a name, and it's hubris.
Imperial hubris, fueled by the intoxicating illusion that might makes right. And the most visceral demonstration of this in the text, as we touched on at the beginning, is the Melian Dialogue in 416 BC.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. We need to dive deeper into the actual mechanics of that conversation, because it is the purest distillation of realpolitik I have ever encountered.
It really is.
Athens sails up to Melos, this tiny Spartan colony that had remained stubbornly neutral, and Athens doesn't even bother to fabricate a pretext for war. They just demand subjugation, and the Melians request a parley.
And the dialogue format Thucydides uses here is really unique in his history. Usually he writes these long set-piece speeches where an orator addresses a crowd.
Right, like Pericles' funeral oration.
Exactly. But here he records a rapid-fire back-and-forth debate between the Athenian envoys and the Melian oligarchs. It reads almost like a modern legal cross-examination.
And the Melians, they try every rhetorical defense available. First, they appeal to the concept of justice. They argue that it is morally wrong for a massive empire to destroy a peaceful neighbor.
Which is a perfectly reasonable argument.
Right. And they warn the Athenians that empires rise and fall, and if Athens destroys Melos today, they will set a precedent of ruthlessness that will be used against Athens when their own power inevitably wanes.
And the Athenian response is just breathtakingly cynical.
Oh, it's chilling.
They explicitly instruct the Melians to leave justice out of the conversation. They state that in the human sphere, justice only exists between equals in power.
Wow.
When there is a power imbalance, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. They treat the subjugation of the weak not as a moral failing, but as an immutable law of physics.
It's the ultimate rejection of a moral universe, but the Melians don't give up. They pivot and they appeal to the gods. They say, "We trust that the gods may grant us fortune as good as yours, since we are just men fighting against unjust." Like, they lean heavily on the divine scales of justice.
And the Athenian counter-argument to that is even more terrifying.
What do they say?
They claim that their actions are entirely in line with divine will. They argue that the gods themselves operate by the exact same rule. Power dictates action.
That's insane.
They tell the Melians, of the gods we believe and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature, they rule wherever they can. They have literally fashioned a theology that perfectly baptizes their own cruelty.
When you strip away all the ancient trappings, this is the exact same logic we see in the modern corporate world or in really toxic environments today.
Oh, absolutely. It hasn't changed.
It's the aggressive, cutthroat career climber who views every relationship as a transaction and every vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation. They believe that if they have the leverage to crush a competitor or manipulate a colleague, the mere possession of that leverage is its own moral justification. Expediency becomes their only god.
But here's the thing. Thucydides doesn't just record the arrogant philosophy. He documents its catastrophic structural failure.
Because raw power never works long-term?
No, it doesn't. Because the Melians refuse to submit, placing their final hope in their Spartan kin coming to their rescue.
And the Spartans, they never come.
No, they don't. The Athenians lay siege to the city, eventually breach the walls, execute all the men of military age, and sell the women and children into slavery.
Just horrific.
On paper, it is a complete, ruthless victory for the doctrine of might makes right. Athens got exactly what it wanted.
But this is where Thucydides reveals his absolute genius. He takes this moment of supreme arrogance, this horrific, unprovoked massacre, and he places it immediately before the turning point of the entire war. What happens in the very next chapter?
The Sicilian expedition.
The juxtaposition is brilliant. Athens, completely intoxicated by their own invincibility after crushing Melos, decides to launch a massive, unprovoked invasion of Sicily.
And Sicily is incredibly far away. It's an entirely different theater of operations.
It's not like sailing to the next island over.
No, it was an expedition of staggering size and expense. It required an unprecedented commitment of ships, hoplites, cavalry, and silver.
And Thucydides explicitly notes the psychological state of the city as the fleet prepared to launch.
Right. He describes a populace gripped by a spectacular optimism and an extravagant hope.
They weren't making a sober strategic calculation.
Not at all. They were driven by an insatiable, greedy desire for endless expansion. They truly believed that because they were strong, the universe would simply bend to their will.
But the logistics alone should have deterred them. I mean, they were attempting to project massive naval power across hundreds of miles of open sea to conquer an island roughly the size of the Peloponnese itself while still technically fighting a war back home.
Right. It was the ancient equivalent of fighting a two-front war on opposite sides of the globe.
And the result was absolute unmitigated annihilation.
It remains one of the most harrowing military disasters in ancient history. Through a series of logistical blunders, superstitious delays, and shifting alliances, the entire Athenian armada was trapped in the harbor at Syracuse.
Their ships were burned or captured.
Tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers were slaughtered, and the survivors were thrown into the stone quarries of Syracuse to die of exposure and starvation.
Wow. The empire that claimed the strong do what they can suddenly found itself entirely stripped of its strength, suffering what it must.
Exactly. The arrogance that built the empire became the very mechanism of its destruction. By acting with unrestrained cruelty at Melos and elsewhere, Athens terrified neutral states into joining the Spartan cause.
They made enemies out of everyone.
They alienated their own allies, turning them into resentful subjects just waiting for an opportunity to rebel. They built an empire on a foundation of fear, and when their power cracked in Sicily, that foundation collapsed.
This moves well beyond historical analysis into profound spiritual reality. When I look at the progression from the Melian Dialogue to the Sicilian disaster, I don't just see geopolitics. I see the mechanics of Proverbs 16.18 playing out in real time.
Pride goes before destruction.
Let a haughty spirit before fall. Exactly.
It is the consistent rhythm of biblical history. You see it woven throughout the Old Testament prophets. God repeatedly raises up massive, arrogant empires like Assyria or Babylon to accomplish his purposes. But then he vehemently judges them for the very hubris that made them terrifying.
Think of Isaiah's critique of Babylon or Habakkuk questioning God about the Chaldeans.
Yes.
The Chaldeans worshipped their own military might. They said, look at what our hands have built. Look at the nations we have crushed. And God's response is essentially, your foundations are dust. You are drunk on your own power and you will choke on it.
And this serves as a glaring, urgent warning for the listener today. Hubris isn't some dead disease relegated to ancient empires. It is an active pathogen in the human heart.
It's the default setting of the fallen mind.
Because when we are honest with ourselves, we all have our own little Melos.
Wow, that's convicting.
We all encounter situations where we hold the leverage. Maybe it's in the workplace, where you have the positional authority to bulldoze a colleague's idea without listening, simply because you can.
Right.
Maybe it's in your family, using your verbal agility to corner a spouse in an argument, forcing them to submit, rather than seeking understanding.
Or tragically, we see it in the church, where leaders push their agendas through sheer force of will, manipulating the weak because they believe their quote-unquote vision justifies the collateral damage.
Thucydides, echoing the warnings of Scripture, stands as a witness that power untethered from justice and humility is entirely self-defeating. You might win the argument today. You might secure the promotion. You might successfully subjugate your opposition.
But you are setting sail for Sicily.
Exactly. You are setting sail for Sicily.
That is a really sobering realization because the mechanism of hubris demands that you constantly expand your control, which inevitably isolates you. You surround yourself with people who fear you, not people who love you.
And loving Christ deeply means fundamentally rejecting that paradigm.
Yes. It means studying how Jesus utilized power.
Yeah.
He possessed ultimate leverage. I mean, he could have called down legions of angels, but he poured his power out for the vulnerable. He never used it to exploit them.
It is the total inversion of the Athenian model. But to fully understand why humanity defaults to the Athenian model, we have to look deeper than just the macro actions of the state.
Right, because Thucydides zooms in, doesn't he?
He does. He moves from imperial warfare to the micro level of societal collapse. He wants to show us exactly what happens to the human psyche when crisis strips away the comforting illusions of polite society.
And this brings us to one of the most psychologically penetrating sections of the entire text, the Corcyraean stasis. Now, for those unfamiliar with the term, stasis is the Greek word for civil strife or civil war, but it implies a very specific kind of internal rot.
It's not just two armies lining up on a battlefield.
Right. It's a society turning entirely inward on itself.
So Corcyra, which is modern-day Corfu, was a powerful naval state. And during the broader war, the island fractured internally. The democratic faction, which was supported by Athens, engaged in a brutal fight-to-the-death conflict with the oligarchic faction, supported by Sparta.
And the breakdown of order wasn't gradual. It was a sudden, violent implosion.
Overnight.
Neighbors who had traded together for decades began slaughtering each other. People were murdered in the sacred temples, which was a massive cultural taboo back then. Fathers literally turned against their own sons based on political affiliation. It was a complete dissolution of the social contract.
And Thucydides uses this horrifying microcosm to formulate a broader philosophical point about the nature of crisis. He argues that in times of peace and prosperity, individuals and states act according to higher motives because they are not constrained by desperate necessity.
They can afford the luxury of morality.
Precisely. But war, he says, is a rough master or a violent teacher.
A violent teacher, meaning it educates us, but it teaches us the darkest possible lessons.
Because war takes away the easy supply of daily wants. It introduces existential fear and artificial scarcity. And in doing so, Thucydides argues, it brings most men's characters down to the level of their fortunes.
It strips away the varnish.
It reveals what is actually operating underneath the veneer of civilization.
And the mechanism of this collapse is fascinating, if horrifying. Because it wasn't just a matter of people getting angry, it was a systemic dismantling of trust.
Yes.
When existential fear enters a society, family ties suddenly become weaker than partisan loyalties. A brother is no longer a brother. He is either an ally or a threat to your survival.
Religious oaths became entirely meaningless. People only kept their word as long as they lacked the power to break it profitably.
But I think the most insidious and profound observation he makes about Corcyra relates to the corruption of language.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
When a society is fundamentally fracturing, the actual definitions of words begin to change to accommodate the violence.
Because people needed to justify their barbarism, so they rebranded their vices as virtues.
The linguistic shift is chilling.
Thucydides writes that reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal ally. If you were a violent extremist willing to commit atrocities for your faction, you weren't called a murderer. You were celebrated as a hero of the cause.
And the inverse was equally true, right?
Yes. Prudence, the ability to think things through, to be careful, moderate, and judicious, was suddenly dismissed as a cloak for cowardice. If you advocated for restraint, you were immediately suspected of treason.
He notes that the ability to understand a question from all sides meant that you were wholly unfitted for action. Like frantic, unthinking violence became the defining attribute of manliness, while moderation was viewed as a threat to the faction's survival.
But it's a complete inversion of reality.
I look at this mechanism, and honestly, I see the exact anatomy of algorithmic social media outrage and modern political polarization.
You're not wrong.
The technology has changed, but the pathology is identical. We see terrible, vitriolic behavior people destroying reputations online, doxing ideological opponents, engaging in pure slander, and depending on which echo chamber you inhabit, that behavior is lauded as heroic activism.
We reward the most extreme voices because reckless audacity is still confused with loyalty.
Exactly. And if a moderate voice steps in and says, hey, let's look at the facts before we ruin this person's life, they are immediately cannibalized by their own side. They are called weak or secret sympathizers. We continually rebrand our viciousness as virtue to justify our anger.
It is a devastatingly accurate portrayal.
But, I want to push back on the underlying premise here just a bit. Is society really just a thin, fragile veneer over a cauldron of psychopathy?
Yeah.
Like, is Thucydides being overly cynical here? It feels like he's suggesting that all human decency is just a convenient fiction we agree upon when our bellies are full. Is that a fair assessment of humanity?
It is a fair assessment of humanity operating apart from the grace of God. Thucydides is not being cynical. He is being clinically accurate about biblical anthropology. Theologically, this connects directly to the doctrine of total depravity, which Paul beautifully articulates in Romans chapter 3.
Where Paul strings together those terrifying Old Testament quotes. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God.
Yes. And notice how Paul specifically highlights the corruption of language and the propensity for violence. Just like Thucydides, Paul writes, their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery.
Man. But total depravity doesn't mean every human being is acting as evilly as they possibly could at all times, right? Because we obviously see acts of common decency.
Right, right. Total depravity means that every faculty of the human person, mind, will, and emotions is fundamentally infected by sin. What Thucydides is describing in Coursera is what happens when God's common grace, the restraining mechanisms of law, conscience, and social order that God institutes to hold back the full expression of human evil, is temporarily lifted from a society.
Wow. When the restraints are removed, the disease rapidly metastasizes.
Exactly. We see the very same dynamic described in the book of James. James asks a diagnostic question in chapter 4. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? He doesn't blame bad logistics or unfair trade deals. He points directly inward.
Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you?
You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. War and crisis do not create the evil in Coursera. They merely act as the violent teacher that reveals the latent hostility and selfishness already dormant in the unredeemed heart.
And this serves as such a vital mirror for the believer. When we talk about using this text to love Christ more, it begins by taking a really hard look at our own hearts under pressure.
Yes.
How do you respond when the easy supply of daily wants is threatened in your life? When conflicts arise, whether it's a bitter theological dispute that threatens to split your church, a high-stakes disagreement with an antagonistic boss, or a deeply painful family fracture, how does your language shift?
Do you find yourself redefining your own reckless audacity as righteous anger?
Oof. Do you excuse your own cruelty, your own slander, your own willingness to assume the worst motives of the other person simply because you believe your cause is just? The Courserian stasis challenges us to recognize that the line dividing good and evil doesn't run between political factions. As Solzhenitsyn noted, it runs right through every human heart.
That's powerful.
Loving Christ deeply means resisting the world's inverted values during times of crisis. It means intentionally holding fast to the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. When every instinct and every voice around you is screaming for partisan warfare.
And to maintain that posture of peacemaking really requires a profound humility regarding our own abilities, which logically brings us to the next major theme embedded in Thucydides' history.
Okay, where does he go next?
Well, if human intellect and morality are this fragile, if they are so easily corrupted by passion and crisis, can we ever truly strategize our way out of disaster?
That's the million-dollar question.
Can human brilliance ultimately conquer the chaos of the world?
And Thucydides answers that question with a resounding, tragic no. He introduces a concept that fundamentally shatters the illusion of human control. The Greeks called it taiche.
Taiche translates roughly to fortune, chance, or fate. It is the incalculable element of the future, the wild card that no strategist can ever fully anticipate. Throughout the entire history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides relentlessly highlights the massive, agonizing gap between human calculation and actual consequence.
We already saw the ultimate example of this in the Sicilian expedition.
Yes, perfect example.
The Athenians calculated everything down to the last drachma. They possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. They brought the most experienced sailors in the Mediterranean. They had immense wealth to fund a protracted siege. Intellectually, militarily, and economically, they had solved the equation.
Yet they were completely undone by an accumulation of contingencies they could not control. They couldn't control the shifting political winds back in Athens that led to the recall and subsequent defection of their most charismatic general, Alcibiades.
Right.
They couldn't control the sudden arrival of a brilliant Spartan commander named Gylippus, who arrived just in time to rally the Syracusan defense.
They couldn't even control the lunar cycle. This part is crazy to me. At a critical moment when the Athenian army desperately needed to retreat, a lunar eclipse occurred.
Right. An eclipse.
And their remaining general, Nicias, who was deeply superstitious, consulted the soothsayers and ordered the army to wait thrice 9 days before moving.
Just sitting there.
That delay allowed the Syracusans to trap them completely, sealing their doom, all because of an eclipse.
Thucydides uses these events to demonstrate that human foresight is inherently frail. You can be the smartest person in the room, you can run all the geopolitical models, you can anticipate your enemy's every logical move, but Taiche always gets a vote, and Taiche is entirely indifferent to human brilliance.
It's a deeply relatable concept even outside of ancient warfare. I think about Someone trying to meticulously engineer the perfect trajectory for their life.
Oh, we all know people like this.
They choose the exact right university, they network with the exact right people, they invest in the safest, most thoroughly researched portfolios, they build a fortress of planning around themselves. And then, a microscopic virus jumps species, a global pandemic shuts down the economy, and their entire carefully constructed reality evaporates in a month. All that human calculation totally dismantled by the incalculable future.
And the realization of Tyche is meant to be a crushing blow to human pride.
But let me challenge the utility of this worldview for a second. If everything is ultimately subject to chance, if an eclipse or a sudden storm can ruin the most brilliant plan, why bother planning at all? Doesn't this heavy emphasis on Tyche just lead to paralyzing fatalism?
Well, that's the risk.
Like, if I can't control the outcome, why not just throw my hands up and surrender to the chaos?
That is the exact despair that a purely secular worldview inevitably produces.
Okay.
Thucydides brilliantly diagnoses the problem, which is our total lack of ultimate control. But because his worldview is confined to the immanent frame, he misidentifies the cause. He sees blind, chaotic Tyche. For the Christian, this is where we must pivot to the canonical perspective.
Because the Bible agrees that we aren't in control.
Yes, but it fundamentally redefines the nature of the force that is. We don't believe in Tyche, we believe in providence.
That is a massive distinction. We are trading a blind mechanism for a sovereign person.
Exactly. Look at Proverbs 16.33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. The rolling of the dice, the seeming randomness of the universe, isn't random at all. Or consider the Apostle Paul in Acts 17.
Where he's at the Areopagus.
Yes. Ironically, he is speaking to the Athenians on the Areopagus, perhaps looking out over the very ruins of the empire. Thucydides chronicled. Paul tells them that God made from one man every nation of mankind, having determined their allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place.
Man, Thucydides forces us to face the absolute terror of an unpredictable universe, stripping away our illusion of mastery. But Scripture takes that terror and replaces it with the comforting reality of a sovereign God who works all things according to the counsel of his will.
Thucydides is performing the necessary demolition work. He has to tear down the idol of self-sufficiency before the foundation of genuine faith can be laid.
And for the listener, this concept is incredibly freeing. Because how many of us are living in a state of chronic anxiety and exhaustion because we are trying to micromanage every variable in our lives?
Most of us.
We try to control our careers, our children's spiritual trajectories, the opinions of our peers. Thucydides holds up the mirror and says, "You can't. You aren't smart enough to outwit the future. Your foresight is frail."
Recognizing that frailty is the birthplace of humility. It transitions you from desperately relying on your own brilliant strategies to resting in a daily reliance on God's providence.
It's the difference between white-knuckling the steering wheel of a car that is hydroplaning versus trusting the designer of the road.
I love that.
Because we cannot control the weather or the waves, that the fate of a community, whether it's a nation, a church, or a family, often rests heavily on the character of the people trying to navigate the storm.
Which brings us right to leadership.
Yes. If foresight is limited, character becomes paramount. Which leads us to Thucydides' a fascinating analysis of leadership.
Right. Thucydides is deeply invested in the question of what makes a good leader, especially in a volatile democratic society. And he constructs a very clear contrast between the statesmen who led Athens at the beginning of the war and the demagogues who took over after his death.
So the gold standard for Thucydides is Pericles.
Yes. Pericles was the preeminent Athenian leader, the architect of their early strategy. Thucydides greatly admired him, specifically highlighting his wise moderation and profound emotional intelligence.
He understood the mob.
He understood the volatility of the Athenian mob. The text notes that because of his manifest integrity and intellectual weight, he was able to control the multitude in a free spirit. He didn't pander to them.
So he wasn't a thermometer just reflecting the temperature of the room. He was a thermostat setting the temperature.
Precisely. If the Athenians were arrogantly confident and pushing for reckless expansion, Pericles would step to the rostrum and speak harsh truths to strike fear into them, grounding them in reality. Conversely, if they were terrified and despairing, such as during the darkest days of the plague, he would deliver soaring rhetoric to restore their confidence. He managed the passions of the state because he was not entirely enslaved by his own passions.
But Pericles dies in 429 BC, a victim of the very plague that ravaged the city.
Yeah, and his absence creates a massive leadership vacuum. The men who step into that vacuum represent a totally different infinitely more dangerous breed of politician.
Right.
Thucydides points out that Pericles' successors were more or less equal to one another in ability, but they were all furiously competing for supremacy. Because they lacked Pericles' inherent authority, they had to rely on pandering to the mob to secure their power. They began to surrender the affairs of state to the whims of the multitude.
And the prime example of this new breed is Alcibiades.
Oh, Alcibiades.
He is one of the most fascinating, chaotic figures in ancient history. Brilliant, devastatingly handsome, incredibly wealthy, and a student of Socrates. But he was driven entirely by an insatiable narcissism.
Thucydides explicitly states that these later leaders were driven by private ambition and private interests. They didn't view the state as an entity to serve, they viewed the state as a vehicle to maximize their own glory.
So when Alcibiades championed the disastrous Sicilian expedition, it wasn't because he soberly believed it was vital for Athenian security.
No, he saw it as an opportunity to secure personal wealth, win military glory, and outshine his political rivals.
He was willing to risk the lives of tens of thousands of his countrymen and the very existence of his civilization to feed his own ego. And when the political winds shifted against him during the expedition, what did he do?
This is the craziest part.
He abandoned his post and defected to Sparta. He actively advised the enemy on how to destroy his own city, just to spite the politicians who opposed him.
Thucydides is demonstrating the catastrophic mechanics of narcissistic leadership. When leaders treat their followers merely as stepping stones, they weaponize the excesses of the crowd. They cultivate outrage, fear, and greed because a polarized, angry populace is easier to manipulate.
They paralyze the state with civil discord because they care more about defeating their internal rivals than addressing external realities.
And this dynamic isn't confined to ancient Athens. We see the ghost of Alcibiades everywhere today.
Oh, absolutely. We see it in politicians who intentionally stoke cultural divisions to drive fundraising. We see it in corporate executives who gut companies for short-term stock bumps to secure their own bonuses, leaving the employees destitute.
And tragically, we see it in the church.
Yes, we do. We see celebrity pastors who build massive platforms based on charisma, but who lack the character to sustain it, eventually immolating their ministries and leaving thousands of disillusioned believers in their wake.
The diagnostic question Thucydides forces us to ask is, what is the underlying motivation of the leader? Is it the welfare of the governed or private ambition?
And this is where the secular history creates the most beautiful, striking contrast with the gospel.
How so?
How does an arrogant 5th century BC Athenian demagogue point us to Jesus? By showing us the exact inverse of his kingdom.
Right. When you look at Alcibiades, the ultimate charismatic, self-serving leader who sacrificed his people for his own glory, it perfectly illuminates the radical nature of Jesus' teaching in Mark chapter 10.
And the context of Mark 10 is so incredibly fitting here. Jesus is walking toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, and his disciples, James and John, pull him aside and essentially ask for the top cabinet positions in his administration.
They want to sit at his right and left hand in glory.
They are exhibiting the exact same private ambition, the same grasp for leverage and prestige that destroyed Athens.
And Jesus gathers the disciples and completely redefines the mechanics of power. He says, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them."
Jesus is acknowledging the Athenian model. He knows exactly how the world operates.
He knows about Melos. He knows about the kings and generals who use people as fuel for their own fires.
But then he issues the mandate for his kingdom. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
It is a breathtaking paradigm shift. Thucydides shows us the logical endpoint of worldly power. It ends in destruction, betrayal, and mass graves in Syracuse. Christ presents an entirely inverted model. True leadership, true authority, is found in self-emptying.
The king doesn't demand that the subjects die to expand his borders. The king dies to secure the life of the subjects.
And this contrast really equips the believer to evaluate their own spheres of influence, because we are all leaders in some capacity.
We all have domains where we exercise authority. It's a mirror for the listener. In your home, are you operating like a miniature Alcibiades? Are you manipulating the mood of the house, demanding that your spouse and children conform to your preferences and serve your comfort?
In your workplace, are you climbing the ladder by stepping on the reputations of your peers?
Thucydides warns us that this worldly model is inherently unstable. True security and true influence are only found by imitating the crucified king. We are called to be servants.
And yet, history proves that humanity consistently defaults to the Alcibiades model. We continually revert to the politics of power and self-interest. Thucydides understood this cyclical nature of history better than anyone, which brings us to his most foundational, overarching philosophical claim.
Right, he makes this incredibly bold statement right at the beginning of his work. He declares that he isn't writing a piece of temporary propaganda to win the applause of the moment. He claims his history is a katoma es aya possession for all time.
And to claim that a book will be perpetually relevant requires a specific underlying premise.
Which is?
Thucydides believed his work would be a useful aid for understanding the future, because he believed the future would inevitably resemble the past. And why would it resemble the past? Because human nature remains fundamentally the same.
He uses the Greek phrase ta anthropina, the human thing, or the human condition.
Yes. Thucydides stripped away the mythology that clouded earlier histories. He didn't blame the war on the whims of Zeus or Apollo. He argued that human behavior, particularly in the political realm, is consistently driven by an unholy trinity of universal psychological forces. He identifies them as fear, honor, and interest.
Those three words are the diagnostic engine of his entire history. Let's break down the mechanics of each one.
Sure. Fear is the baseline. It is the existential dread of vulnerability. It's the paranoia that the other guy is going to get you first, which necessitates preemptive aggression.
Like Sparta going to war fundamentally out of fear of the growing power of Athens.
Exactly. It's the driving force behind every arms race in history.
Yeah.
Then there is honor. This isn't honor in the noble chivalric sense. This is prestige, reputation, saving face, and the desire for glory.
It's the absolute refusal to look weak.
Right? Athens couldn't back down from conflicts, even strategically unwise ones, because it would damage their prestige and encourage their subjects to rebel. And finally, interest. This is naked greed, the desire for material advantage, land, resources, and wealth.
The Sicilian expedition was driven largely by the interest of the politicians who stood to profit financially from the conquest.
Exactly.
I am continually struck by the diagnostic accuracy of this. We are looking at a text composed 2,400 years ago, and it perfectly maps the motivations behind modern geopolitics. Why did the Cold War happen? A mixture of fear regarding nuclear annihilation, ideological honor, and geopolitical interest.
Why do great power rivalries exist today? Fear, honor, and interest.
And it scales all the way down to toxic office politics. Why do people backstab each other in a corporate setting? Fear that they'll be downsized, honor because they crave the prestige of the vice president title, and interest because they want the accompanying salary bump. The human source code hasn't received an update since Genesis 3.
The continuity is undeniable. The sources note that Thucydides' tripartite diagnosis resonates deeply with ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions, where kings boast of conquests driven by the exact same motives.
Oh, fascinating.
It echoes the cyclical power struggles recorded by Herodotus. Thucydides provides a purely secular, immanent analysis of human motivation, but it acts as a perfect empirical confirmation of the biblical doctrine of fallenness.
It's the historical proof text for Jeremiah 17.9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?
Thucydides understood the sickness. He mapped the pathology of the deceitful heart with terrifying clinical precision.
And understanding that pathology is incredibly equipping for the Christian in terms of cultural engagement.
How does understanding the sickness help us engage the culture?
Because it cures us of naivety. Jesus commands his followers to be innocent as doves, but wise as serpents. Understanding the pervasive influence of fear, honor, and interest allows you to analyze politics, rhetoric, and conflict with sober realism.
You see right through the spin. Exactly. When a politician or a corporate leader delivers a sweeping speech about noble ideals, spreading democracy, or revolutionizing the industry for the good of humanity, Thucydides trains your ear to listen for the subtext. He teaches you to ask, where is the underlying fear? How does this policy protect their prestige and honor? Who is profiting from this interest?
It totally inoculates you against propaganda. You can engage with the political and social structures of the world without being easily duped by their utopian promises. You recognize that no political platform can ever legislate the sin out of the human heart.
But while Thucydides is brilliant at diagnosing the illness, his utility ends there. He offers no cure.
That is the ultimate tragedy of his work. He lays out the cancer of fear, honor, and interest, and he essentially says, here it is, it has always been here, and it will eventually destroy everything you build. He has no medicine to offer.
Only the gospel provides the antidote to ta anthropina. Only the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit can replace the paralyzing dread of fear with the perfect love that casts out fear. Only the finished work of Christ can replace our desperate worldly pursuit of honor with the humble, peaceful desire to simply glorify God. And only a deep trust in God's providence can replace our greedy pursuit of self-interest with radical generosity and contentment. Thucydides points out the absolute necessity of a savior by proving that we cannot save ourselves.
So, if a secular pagan text can be this illuminating for a Christian, if it can cure our naivety and drive us to appreciate the gospel, how have believers historically navigated this tension? Because there is a danger here.
What kind of danger?
Well, we are immersing ourselves in the worldview of a man steeped in raw power politics and tragedy. How has the church historically used these texts without absorbing their darkness?
Actually, the church has a very long, robust tradition of doing exactly what we are doing today. The early church fathers were masterful at engaging with classical Greek and Roman literature, but they did so with intense discernment.
They weren't isolationists, but they weren't syncretists either.
Exactly. A prime example is Augustine of Hippo. In his monumental work, The City of God, Augustine draws heavily on Greek and Roman historians, including the tradition of Thucydides. He uses their own historical accounts of wars, political betrayals, and civil collapse to systematically dismantle pagan pride.
He essentially turns their own historical record against them.
He does. He says, look at your own historians. Look at the chaos they document. Your earthly city, built on love of self, even to the contempt of God, is inherently unstable and marked by endless bloody conflict.
And then he contrasts that with the heavenly city.
Yes. He contrasts the constant strife and stasis of the earthly city with the profound, enduring peace of the heavenly city, which is built on the love of God, even to the contempt of self. Another crucial example is Basil the Great.
What did Basil do?
He wrote a specific address to young Christian men on how they should read pagan Greek literature.
And how did he advise them to approach it?
He used a brilliant analogy. He argued that Christians should approach these texts like bees approaching flowers. A bee doesn't consume the entire flower. It lands, extracts the nourishing nectar, and leaves the rest behind.
That is such a great picture.
Basil argued that Christians should extract the true insights about human nature, virtue, and history while leaving behind the toxic pollen of idolatry and fatalism.
So we read selectively, governed by the ultimate authority of Scripture. If Thucydides observes that unchecked power leads to arrogance and destruction, the Christian can boldly agree, because that aligns perfectly with Proverbs.
We extract the nectar of his historical observation.
But when Thucydides implies that the universe is governed by blind chance and that might makes right is an unbreakable natural law, we recognize that as poison and discard it.
This methodology is vital for your daily life. It models how you can interact with any secular thought today, whether you are reading a modern sociological study, analyzing a political treatise, or discussing philosophy with a skeptical colleague.
You don't have to be afraid of the truth, regardless of who is speaking it, because all truth ultimately belongs to God.
And it establishes common ground for evangelism. You can sit down with a non-believing friend who is deeply cynical about the state of the world, someone who looks at the corruption in politics and the greed in corporate structures and feels total despair.
And you can agree with their diagnosis.
You can say, you're right. Human nature is fundamentally broken by self-interest and fear. The system is rigged by hubris.
But the story doesn't end in the stone quarries of Syracuse. Let me tell you about a king who possessed ultimate power, but refused to leverage it for his own interest. A king who laid down his life for his enemies to break that cycle of tragedy.
We use the accurate, terrifying diagnosis of the secular world to urgently point them to the divine cure.
It is the ultimate apologetic pivot.
It really is.
Well, this has been a profoundly heavy but necessary exploration. Let's trace the arc of what we've uncovered today. We started by looking at how Thucydides, writing from the margins of exile, utilized the structure of a tragedy to give us an unvarnished, high-definition portrait of the fallen old man.
We saw the terrifying consequences of the might makes right philosophy in the Melian Dialogue, and how that exact same imperial hubris blinded Athens and led to their utter annihilation in Sicily.
We analyzed how war and crisis act as violent teachers, stripping away the fragile veneer of society, corrupting our very language, and revealing the total depravity that lurks beneath the surface.
We confronted the frailty of human foresight against the unpredictable force of the future, recognizing that our inability to control our destiny should drive us to trust deeply in God's sovereign providence.
We contrasted the self-serving, narcissistic ambition of demagogues like Alcibiades with the self-emptying servant leadership of Jesus Christ. And we recognize that the core drivers of human history, fear, honor, and interest, haven't changed an iota in 2,400 years, proving the absolute necessity of a savior to change the human heart.
And really, the entire exercise is designed to cultivate a profound humility. By staring into the murky, violent depths of human history without God, we are driven to our knees in overwhelming gratitude for the redemptive, intervening grace of Jesus Christ.
We study the darkness to better appreciate the light. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative detail about Thucydides' masterpiece. It's a detail that moves this from an ancient history lesson into a direct personal challenge. After painstakingly documenting decades of political maneuvering, battles, plagues, and civil wars, Thucydides' history doesn't actually have a conclusion.
It breaks off entirely abruptly in the year 411 BC.
It is an unfinished work. The manuscript literally ends mid-sentence, right in the thick of the conflict. Thucydides died before he could finish writing the story. He never got to record the final resolution. And as you go about your week, I want you to think about your own unwritten story.
That's right.
You are living right now in a world that is still relentlessly driven by fear, honor, and interest. You will face the exact same temptations of hubris in your workplace and your home. You will face the exact same desires to use raw power to force your will. You will experience the exact same chaotic unpredictability of the future. The diagnosis of your human nature is clear, and the historical trajectory of that nature is tragic.
But your ending hasn't been written yet.
The sentence of your life is still suspended. Will the unfinished chapters of your story simply repeat the tragic cycles of the Athenian Empire, driven by pride, private ambition, and a desperate, exhausting grab for control? Or will you recognize the disease, lay down your arms, and allow the grace of the crucified king to step into your narrative and write a different ending entirely? Let the diagnosis drive you to the great physician. Think about that as you navigate this fallen, tragic, but ultimately redeemable world.